Good evening. Welcome to Progressive Soup. My name is David Stevenson. I'll be tonight's host. With me, I have State Representative Dan Carter. He represents the 2nd District in Connecticut in the State House. And he covers 4 towns, portions of 4 towns.
That's correct.
Portions of Bethel, portions of Danbury, portions of Reading, or all of Reading?
Northern third of Reading.
The northern third of Reading, and a portion of Newtown, which was added on to his after the most recent census in 2010. They redistricted a tiny bit. Dan, tell us a little something about yourself. You've been in the state house for 2 terms now, or 3?
I'm halfway through my 2nd term.
Okay.
So right now I'm entering, I would say, my 4th session. Mm-hmm. And before I chose to try the politics thing, I was involved in sales, medical sales, for many years, and before that, the Air Force.
And we're involved in some great missions as a pilot.
Oh yeah, I loved it. I was in the first Desert Storm. I came on in the ending of the Desert Storm, mm-hmm. and then Bosnia, the humanitarian relief.
Yeah.
In the early '90s, we did a thing called Provide Promise, which actually we flew more cargo than the Berlin airlift in that period of time, and we were taking food in and out of war-torn Bosnia, and it was really amazing. In and out of Sarajevo, and they had these safe zones where they basically, the United Nations would get people together and protect them. So I did that for many years. I should say a few years. And then I taught pilot training for a while. Came out to Connecticut, chose to move here. I actually moved to Reading at first. Mm-hmm. And I've been in Bethel now for probably almost 10 years. Coming close. So, yeah. And along the way, I got the idea to get involved in politics. And here I am.
Excellent. Now it's important to note that the State House and the State Senate, these are part-time jobs. But they're full-time jobs disguised as part-time jobs.
Yes.
They meet in session twice a year, is it?
Once a year.
Once a year. They meet once a year in session. But, of course, in between those meetings, they're discussing issues with people from all walks of life, from lobbyists to residents, and gathering information that helps them decide how to vote. Now, we had an incident in Newtown a couple of years ago, almost 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, that was horrific and shocking. It involved a school, Sandy Hook Elementary School, being broken into by a young man carrying some weaponry who killed 20 students and 6 faculty members. My former sister-in-law was the nurse in the school, and she was fortunate enough to hide far enough under her desk in her office and stayed there for hours and hours and hours before she finally felt comfortable that the people that were walking around in the school were the good guys and not somebody with weaponry ready to kill her, because she knew what had taken place throughout the school. Okay, Connecticut last year had a lot of discussion about gun legislation, limiting certain types of weaponry, and registration of those types of weaponry that were already out there that people already own legally, registration of those things. And there was a bill that came through the House and through the Senate. It passed. Representative Carter voted against that bill. And I want him to have the opportunity to, as part of our discussion, to discuss that bill, tell you, the audience, what about the bill he liked, what about the bill he didn't like, and what and how he came down on the side of voting against it in the end.
Okay,
Dan,
great.
go ahead.
Well, let's see. To put things in context, after the tragedy, there's no question that everybody wanted to do something, and we all recognized that this was an opportunity to look at gun control, as well as the other parts of the solution, which is mental health and school safety security.
Yes.
So when that happened, there was a bipartisan task force put together called basically was a working group, and I was on the gun working group of that. It was there were three parts. There was one for guns, there was one for school safety security, and there was one for mental health.
The three aspects.
The three aspects of what we thought would encompass the most, I would say, the plausible solutions to this kind of tragedy or preventing this kind of tragedy in the future. So in my role in the gun violence working group, or I should say gun violence prevention working group, I was able to be involved intimately with a lot of things going on as all these ideas came to the surface. Yeah. Now, even before that, I'd already put in a couple of bills myself. I do believe in background checks 100%. There's no question about that. I put that in. I actually put in a couple of bills that were very controversial. One mandating gun safes for people who own guns, which was very controversial for a lot of people. I also believe in mandating additional training. Sometimes we go after the gun and try to ban things, but we don't look at the training part of it first and say, our program basically, once you're trained or you go through the NRA safety course, you don't receive any training after that. Oh. So there really should be a requirement as you go around and do your permit to have gone to a range.
Now the NRA actually, this is the part of the NRA that I like, National Rifle Association, and that they're very active in training people in gun safety. And I think that that's something that we don't talk enough about. Obviously, there's a political arm of the NRA which does a lot of things that I consider to be very bad in terms of allowing straw sales, keeping straw sales active in parts of America. So guns can be purchased without background checks and then taken from there. A person will go and buy literally dozens of weaponry and transport them to, let's say, Chicago, because a lot of it ends up in Chicago, where they have very good anti-sales, very good measures in order to control guns in Chicago and to lessen violence. But people put them in their car, they drive them in, and they sell them on the open market to kids who end up killing other kids. Having said that, I want to go back and mention that they do the gun safety. Now, continue.
Well, interesting enough, I mean, the NRA does do a lot of gun safety stuff. There's no question about it. There are a lot of things the NRA does very poorly. I believe you should do background checks, not because particularly they're going to save anybody. Really, in the big scheme of things, I don't know if they're going to prevent deaths or save lives. I don't think that's. But what they will do is help crack down on what you said: straw purchases, illegal trafficking. Those are areas where, in fact, this fell very short this last time around, and I had a big problem with it, which we'll get to.
Okay.
But looking at what was coming down the pike, and the way the gun safety working group went, or the gun violence prevention working group went, we didn't get to a lot of those things even on the table. It was very politically motivated. There was, basically one faction there kind of pushing it through, that no matter what happened, there was an agenda that they had to have it. So it kind of blew apart. So when we got to the final bill did some things that just went too far for me. Number one, I should say the far part. The way we were going after the registering of the AR-15, and I should say the way they defined assault weapons being any gun with a pistol grip under the action, et cetera, et cetera. Most of that was really kind of ludicrous in my book.
Because
I think what happens is what we have now is not going to prevent anybody from getting hurt ever. Like everything's still out there. Magazine capacity was one area I think we can look at and find a program that would have been better than what we did. What we did is in this law, it just says you have to declare how many you have. They're still on the street. They're still out there. Magazine capacity was the one part of looking at a rifle like the AR-15 that determines the lethality of that gun. It's not how it looks. It's not where the pistol grip is. It's the number of rounds that you can put out through a weapon.
in a short period
of time.
Yeah.
And so any weapon that has multiple rounds. So to look at magazine capacity, I think was totally legitimate, and we could have found, I think, better ways than just saying, well, we're going to declare how many you have, and it's a very unenforceable, kind of a ridiculous law. The other part of the law, the way we put it in place is, it didn't. I mean, a lot of people didn't register their stuff. Obviously, we've heard that on the news. Not that was our goal, or should have been our goal, but the cost incurred with the way we did this and not saving any lives was really pretty bad. Because for me as a legislator, and when I'm looking at the policy, I want to affect that interaction in the sale and who that gun goes to. That's the important part. It's not so much about saying that you can't have a gun out there on the street, but I want to make sure I'm targeting that interaction so it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. Part of that is the gun trafficking issues. In fact, Democrats in Hartford voted against that gun bill. And they did so because it did nothing to really prevent what's killing people in the state of Connecticut. It was all focused on one piece. And that's just the gun portion. I mean, we're speaking of that.
Yep.
There were faults in the other two portions, which I think gave politicians their chance to go out there and beat their chest and say, look what we passed, we did something to help. But I really would have loved to have seen a bill that was, number one, more thought out, like went through the committee process. I think we would end up with a better bill. It would have limited magazines.
Yeah. It
would have probably had training for people. Reoccurrent training, maybe even more training to be able to own a semi-automatic rifle like that. I think there would have been better ways to look at it. And we would have had money put aside to look at actual gun violence in Hartford, New Haven, Bridgeport.
Where you have a lot of people together because there's cities,
right,
and a lot of people together. You get these situations where people get angry.
Yeah. And I also
one person gets angry at another person, and if they have a gun available to them, they act without a lot of thought.
Yeah, and I think most of the guns that I'm hearing about are used in criminal activity, obviously. And you get some young 17, 18-year-old kid goes out and they're able to get access to a weapon like that. Like, we've done nothing to help that. And so
young men and their guns.
I look at that and I think
their testosterone.
It was really short-sighted. Now, we have a long way to go as a country to fix this stuff, because I do think that the national background check needs to be fixed. I think that the fact that the NRA has stood in front of that, or should kept that from happening, is pretty disgusting, because those are key elements to making sure we're able to fix this problem with gun violence.
Continue. I want to hear some things that you maybe in fact can even introduce, or certainly advocate and maybe even introduce into the now that we know that something's happened, it's going to happen again. What are some things that you can introduce that will prevent, or at least help prevent, future incidents?
It's difficult. The gun control part of it, if we're just speaking the gun control part of it, which obviously is not the entire part, I do think maybe mandating gun safes in some situations with some kinds of guns, looking at reoccurring training, like I mentioned before. If you have somebody who's going to own, different kinds of assault weapons, we should put a rifle course out there or something. And the reason is people who are more likely to want to get those will go through those programs. You don't have to make it absorbently expensive. You don't. What I don't agree with is when people try to pass legislation that penalizes gun owners and tries to keep control their behavior by penalizing them through a tax, or my favorite was they wanted to limit it to one shot. A gun with one shot, or they wanted to penalize people on ammo, like 150% tax. See, that never made sense to me, because I would rather people who are avid sportsmen go to the range. I think there's a real safety issue there. So let people go shoot, but control the access to the weaponry in the right way. Now, the other parts that need to be looked at.
Maybe if gun ranges had the primary access to that type of weaponry and that type of magazines.
We actually discussed that. We did discuss that in the sense that, is there somewhere you could basically put the weapon? Now, the constitutional issues that keep coming up around this, obviously the ability for people to right to bear arms and all that sort of stuff, that's where it gets very tricky. I came a long way in looking at gun. I mean, if you would have asked me 2 years ago how I felt, I would have a much different view. I was much more hardcore, Second Amendment, but I do realize that even in the days when the Second Amendment,
at least that snippet in the Second Amendment that we hear all the time, while not hearing the other portions of the Second Amendment about the fact that the Second Amendment allows a state to have a militia. It allows a town or a city to have a police force, where the British controlled everything prior to that. That's what they were legislating against.
Yeah, it was a little more than that in the sense. If you remember, a lot of this was because during the Revolutionary War they were coming to get the arms. I mean, I think there was an understanding that an armed citizenry of whatever that looked like, an armed citizenry was advantageous, whether you call it national security. I mean, I would call it national security because that's how I look at it in today's terms.
And certainly back in those days, that's absolutely true. Now the question is whether that still applies.
That's the question.
Today's modern urban areas where you have a lot more people together.
Well, that is the question. I mean, the question is, do we have the responsibility, or can people do that? I mean, I think the Second Amendment. I mean, everybody interprets it their way. I mean, I can give you the way I look at it.
Yeah.
The Second Amendment clearly says that you have the right to bear arms. Okay, so you have the right to bear arms to protect yourself, and the reason that happens is we want to be able to raise a militia, right? And we want a well-regulated militia.
Right.
If you look at the militia acts following the Revolution, obviously even at that time, there were regulations. In fact, they wanted people to have guns. But there were limits and there were regulations on guns. So I don't believe we don't regulate guns. But I think we go too far at some point where we say, all right, we're going to ban all these types of guns when realistically the ability to have them should still be there. And I honestly, I don't know where we're going to be in 20 years, but I do see a national security interest that if you have people who are trained and licensed and responsible, we need to be able to affect that. Listen, we choose all the time who in society we trust to have weapons. Now, we'll let a police officer have all this automatic weapons,
and they carry a lot. They carry a lot of heavy-duty stuff.
Heavy-duty stuff.
Yeah.
And you really question, well, what's so different about them than us? Yeah, do they go through a psych eval? I mean, somehow we look at them and we trust them. I'll tell you, plenty of police officers out there are amazing and great, but there's a few out there that I wouldn't want owning a gun. So I think somewhere in society we have to look at that for what it is, and I think we need to go after where people are really getting killed and the violence. And that's the other thing. None of this addressed violence. None of this addressed the root causes of violence in our inner cities and the crime and all these things that go with it. And remember, we're still only talking about 1/3 of that bill.
Yeah.
The mental health part of it is huge. Because the day that this happened, I'll never forget it. I was at Homeless Connect down at the Danbury War Memorial. Yeah. Great program. Anybody out there get a chance to participate in Homeless Connect, go. It's a great way to give.
Connect. That's at the Danbury
War Memorial. They do it once a year, and what they do is they provide access to different resources to homeless people. So while I was there, I was having a conversation that morning about the problems with mental health and homeless. And what was happening is, people are out of the home, so there's nobody to coordinate their care. And once they get in, if they ever go off their meds, they go out. It's like this vicious cycle. Yeah. That's exactly what was happening to this young man in Newtown. Nobody was really coordinating his care because once he left high school, he's out there in the big world, and his mom, for whatever reason, protecting his child, whatever, really made some bad choices. And if we had a better way to look for those folks and give them more resources, this kind of thing would never happen.
But on the other hand, it's been said, I've heard some people that have thrown out the idea, put out the idea that if prior to that, if the AR-15 were not an allowable weapon for people in Connecticut to own, she was a law-abiding citizen, if nothing else, certainly.
Right.
Then she would not have had that. And after he went to Dick's Sporting Goods, tried to buy some weaponry, didn't want to wait for the background check, went home, broke into her gun cabinet, and did what he did. Well, if she were a law-abiding citizen, that gun would not have been in her home.
Let me. There's a couple little things there that need to be tweaked. I'm not sure about the visit to Dick's, how much of that's true or not. And by the way, we never got the full report even while we were doing all this. We had very little information about what actually happened, which was a big problem.
Yeah,
for
they held back a lot of that.
Because I'm making policy. Yeah. I was trying to make policy based on what we thought happened.
I think the parents were the parents of the kids were a little bit against some very sensitive information, including photos of their kids in the morgue.
But there was more than that. I mean, frankly, the stuff that should have been out there with respect to the state police and all that, the information wasn't given to us. And that was a problem. I still have issues with that, obviously. But the way I understood it was she openly, that was his gun safe. It wasn't hers. So, or it was hers and she had it locked up and he stole the stuff out of it because he had the combination.
Right.
But this was a bonding experience these two had going with using weapons. Obviously the wrong person to ever do that with. So the question is, if the AR-15 wasn't in that cabinet, what would have happened? Guy would have used a shotgun. The guy would have used an M1 carbine or a rifle that didn't have a pistol grip that had the same amount of destructive damage or more than an AR-15.
He would have been able to kill 26 people in less than 3 minutes?
See, here's the thing. We have this vision of what the AR-15 really is. The AR-15 is actually a lower caliber weapon, but high muzzle velocity, I guess you would say that. The problem was it had 15 or 30 rounds in it.
This is essentially the gun that they used in Vietnam.
It's a little bit different, but it's more of a civilian version. The real difference is that an M16 has a rapid fire, like you could turn it on and just hold the trigger and keep going. An AR-15 is 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's really no different than any hunting rifle. It's no different than any, like there's an M1 carbine somebody can go out and buy right now, which was a weapon used in Korea. It has a higher round magazine, which you have to declare the magazine now or get a 10-round magazine. It's still the same thing. Boom, 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 boom. It doesn't matter that the pistol grip was on it. It doesn't matter. Like there are higher caliber weapons that are much more destructive than what this was. But we're also talking about where this target was, and it was just a horrific thing. They were children. So getting back to the destructiveness of the weapon, it's probably not that much different than anything else except for the number of rounds it could fire, which is exactly why we have the assault weapons ban. The assault weapons bans before were looking at military-style weapons that had a rapid fire capability.
So you could sit there, rounds.
Right, and that's the line. And for me, that's kind of where I made the distinction, because I looked at what that really is. And it's not any different than most hunting rifles, with the exception of the capacity of the magazine. So that's why looking at capacity of magazines we can talk about. But going and banning the gun, and I should say banning the gun and then having a registration process that's costly and cumbersome, costs us hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in the state, has really jeopardized a lot of our citizens. It's created this little war between people who have guns and people who don't. And the way they look at each other, and it's really bad. So I looked at all that. And
common ground sometimes hard to find on emotional issues.
It was very hard. It was emotional. I mean, this whole thing was not an easy situation for me. It was a really horrible year. I mean, we're all human. We go through this and we look at this different ways. But I learned a lot. And like I said, I opened my mind a lot to the regulation and what we can do. I just still think we haven't even touched the problem. We haven't even touched the problem. We just did this, huge bill, and politicians were all happy, saying, "Look, we've done something." I don't think we've even skimmed the surface of the problem.
So this will be an ongoing thing, hopefully, and we won't just let this be the end of it and put it behind us. And
my honest opinion is I don't know if we're going to do anything about it. That was one of the problems I had during the process. See, I can say this here, but the average person is not going to hear this. On that committee, the gun violence working group, it was kind of a joke the way it went, because a lot of the real issues never got put up, like talking about gun violence, talking about other opportunities to control, never even made it to the surface. Now that we've pushed this bill through, nobody wants to touch it. See, what happens in the legislature, you put something through very controversial, a lot of people don't want to revisit it because they know what a can of worms it's going to open up. So I don't believe there's going to be any honest look at doing it, because people get afraid. That's why the NRA is such a pain in the butt, because the NRA has developed their position and they're going to stick with it no matter what. Most people out there believe in background checks. So how come the NRA is standing in the way? And they don't believe that it's going to save anybody, but they believe it's common sense that you should have a background check. And by the way, if you've had a felony in Missouri, that should show up in Connecticut. And that's the problem. So, no, I don't know if anybody will take a look at it, because the legislature doesn't get an appetite to do so when things are very, very controversial. I mean, I'll give you an example. 2 years ago, there was a guy in a pizza joint, and he had a permit to carry. I think he reached up to pick up a pizza box or something, and somebody saw the gun in his belt. Now, at the time, somebody called the police. He was arrested, all this sort of stuff happened. Well, lo and behold, in Connecticut, we've always told people you have to carry concealed. The law doesn't say that. The law doesn't say it. You are allowed to carry open if you want. But what they do is they'll come after you for breach of peace. And people now have started challenging that. So now we have this, I think, a huge quandary that we should, as a legislature, come in and handle that. Nobody wanted to touch it because it was a gun bill. And then lo and behold, the whole Newtown thing happened. And so now I don't know if anybody wants to go back and fix it, because I think there are things we could look at. I really do. So. Well,
I hope you can come up with even some small bits of legislation that they can add to some real solutions. We can avoid because it was
horrific.
It was a tough day. It was a tough day and a tough week and a tough month and a tough year. Not just for the families who were touched by this, but for all of us.
There's no question this touched the world. I mean, I got a lot of mail, got a lot of stuff from all over the world coming in on this, and it touched a lot of people, because I don't think anybody didn't go home and look at their kids differently that night.
Speaking of mail, do you find yourself getting spammed a lot with email?
Yeah.
You would get where somebody will say to a group of people, "Oh, by the way, here's a list of people." Because I go on a little website called Patriot something or other, and I don't go there to fight with them or battle with them. I just go there to have a little discussion and try to make a point, and ultimately I'll get called some names, but it doesn't bother me. So we try to keep the discussion going, and occasionally people will find common ground on some minor issues. But they sent out they had a recent article about the Newtown incident and the fact that people are resisting registering their guns. Some people are resisting registering the guns. And they had the list of all the legislators in Connecticut, and here you go. Here's a list. Write them all. Beat up on them all.
Yeah, you know what? It's interesting because I'll tell you my perspective, because I can only tell you mine. I get a lot of mail, obviously. I get a lot of email. And there's a lot of them that come through as form letters. So you'll have one organization on an issue. Sunday Sales, for instance. We can get away from guns for a second.
Yeah.
Sunday Sales, a couple of years ago, Stop and Shop had cards sitting in their place, I guess.
Yeah.
And people would fill them out. Next thing you know, you'd start getting emails from people. And there'd be a form letter, and they would sign it with their name and their address.
Yeah.
Now, that compared to an email that comes to me directly from a constituent, obviously, I mean, I look at both, but I do weigh it and understand where that came from.
So one that comes from the heart rather than from the form letter, obviously, is going to count much more.
Yeah, and believe me, I take a look at the form letter ones too, because I want to know. I want to know where they came from. I track them, and I do. I keep an eye where they come from, and sometimes we'll do form responses. But
how many? Okay.
If it's something that is really near and dear to their heart, and it makes it a lot easier for me to connect with them and ask what they think. I do the same with public testimony. If I see testimony on a bill, and maybe it's not even my committee, many times I'll reach out to that person. I'll see they're from Bethel or somewhere in my district, and I'll say, "Hey, can we meet and talk about this, or what do you think?" Because it's about the information, and that's how I stay in tune to what people really want.
Quick moment. Give you a chance to talk a little bit about you're going to see a bill, I think, this year that has to do with transportation of, and I'll use the scientific term, hydrofracturing. But, of course, the industry decided it should be called hydrofracking, which is probably a pretty bad choice, because it's just a fracking bad term to use.
Get the frack out of here.
Yeah. Well, the legislature would, at the very least, block our water treatment plants from processing this water, this polluted water from the hydrofracturing process. And at the greatest, it would prevent those trucks from traveling across Connecticut. And it's to me, it's a public safety issue to protect our citizens from something that even if we're not doing it here, we can feel the damage from what they've done somewhere else. Thoughts?
Well, it's interesting. This has actually come before one of my committees.
Okay.
I am on energy technology. So the bill has come through, in the sense it's come through the public hearing process. I was able to hear some of the public hearing Unfortunately, I didn't get all of it because I was in a general law public hearing as well.
Yeah.
But when I'm looking at this, where I stand now, yes, there's part of this bill. People are trying to prevent fracking. Period. I mean, part of this is just into the whole anti-fracking movement. No question about it. That's what the end goal is. But I think there are some very real legitimate concerns among other people, including myself. That is, and I am not 100% on this yet, can our wastewater treatment plants even fix it? There are a lot of folks who believe that some of the fracking waste can't be broken down properly to be treated.
Then there's things in it like bromides, for instance,
right.
And there's a lot of chemicals in that water that they have not been responsible. Yeah. Have not been told that they have to even divulge.
Well, and that's what I'm doing right now is I'm actually educating myself as much as I can about the practice and what's in the water. Because from my perspective, okay, if we can have them come in Connecticut and they can be treated in a wastewater plant and it's not going to be toxic or anything to our citizens, maybe that's okay.
Time to say goodbye?
1 minute.
Okay, 1 minute? Yeah. Okay, continue.
Finishing up, the other part of this is whether or not they make fracking waste hazardous waste. That's another part of this. Because if we make it hazardous waste, that controls the ability to transport it through our state. And that's where you were getting at. So, long story short, I don't know what I'm going to do on the bill yet because I haven't got all the information. Part of me is if there's an outcry from my state that says we don't want it, I'm not going to let it go. That's it.
And here's something for all the constituents out there to likewise. It's not just on the legislature to study these things and vote on it. You need to study it too, become educated, and then share your thoughts, digest and share your thoughts with your state legislature and your state senator.
Idea for a show one of these days.
Yeah.
Have me come in. I'll go through the website, how to use it, where to find public hearing testimony. That way anybody out there can take a look at it and follow bills.
That'd be excellent.
Oh.
Thank you very much, Dan. Again.
Anytime.
Dan Carter, state representative from the 2nd District, which encompasses a portion of Reading, a portion of Danbury, a portion of Bethel, and a portion of Newtown. Thanks. Enjoy your evening.